Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We are now going to have our second panel, again, following the same format. It will be followed by remarks by Craig and then an open discussion. So now I would like to welcome Tiffany TUNG, who is professor and chair of the Department of Anthropology at Vanderbilt University. Tiffany TUNG is an anthropological bioarchaeologist whose work explores how society structured health outcomes for populations in the past. She examines how past instances of state power, imperialism, and colonialism impacted and continue to impact people and their communities. In collaboration with local Peruvian scholars and community members, she documents such things as violence-related trauma on the skeleton, skeletal and dental lesions indicative of disease, and isotopic signatures to reveal insights into diet and foodways. These material data are integrated with theoretical perspectives on structural violence, embodiment, and the process of gender and identity construction to tackle questions about how health and society are entangled. She has published numerous articles and book chapters on these topics, and her book, Violence, Ritual, and the Warring Empire, a social bioarchaeology of imperialism in the ancient Andes, was published in 2012 by the University Press of Florida. Thank you, Tiffany, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking the organizers and the center for putting together this session and inviting me to contribute. I'm going to share my screen. And can you see it? Just so I can get a thumbs up that you can see it. Excellent.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. So I speak to you today from Nashville, and in this land acknowledgement, I note that these are the original lands of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians, the Cherokee Nation, the United Kiowa Band of the Cherokee Indians, the Muskogee Nation, and the Chickasaw Nation. So subjugation, servitude, and slavery, all of these inhibit bodily autonomy to some degree, but the details of these differences can have distinctly profound effects on health and lived experience. The social, economic, political, and ritual structures that create and maintain certain conditions, and the resulting loss of bodily autonomy for some is a crucial line of inquiry for comprehending the social processes that give rise to these varying forms of inequality. How did institutions of servitude develop and become enshrined as a normal way of organizing society in the pre-Hispanic Andes and elsewhere? And how do we document these systems of inequality when there are no written records, but only material traces comprised of skeletonized bodies, architectural features, and remnants of the social world made material through ceramics, textiles, weapons, iconography, and the like. This study focuses on the pre-Hispanic Peruvian Andes to explore these themes from a bioarchaeological perspective, which places the corporal and representations of the corporal at the core of analysis. I discuss the ways we can use the material record to document the creation and effects of various forms of servitude over the short and long term. In particular, I conduct what is known as an osteobiography to tell empirically based stories about two women who lived about 1,200 years ago and who appeared to be non-local to a warring community. They were outsiders, possibly captives, as I will show, and they were treated differently from everyone else. This raises crucial questions that Resendez has previously raised. Even if we can't call these systems of servitude slavery in an institutional sense, we can give proper and empathetic weight to how these systems were experienced by the people themselves, their lived experience, their health outcomes, their untimely deaths. The academic and legal terminologies are necessary, of course, but do these obscure our anthropological efforts to see the experiences, suffering, and resilient responses of the person subjected to subjugation? As a bioarchaeologist whose key source of information is the body itself, I am pressed to attempt an interrogation from the perspective of the person who was poorly treated by others and socially violated once again in death. Some of our discussions about slavery depend on shared notions of individualism and individual autonomy, concepts that may not be as well situated or well suited for understanding how pre-Hispanic peoples understood themselves and their relations to other humans, animals, and landscapes. Boundaries were blurred, and Andean ontologies highlight the kin groups, the communal, the ecological, and the connections between all. This critical framing should not be taken as an idealized harking back to indigenous peoples living in a state of nature, a hollow caricature that does little to clarify the different ways of being in this world. Indeed, even as communities in the Andes, quote, have been touted for their collective spirit, there is concern that this highlighting of Andean collectivity is an Andeanist version of Orientalism, as Ornstein has stated. Nonetheless, as analysts of society, we are reminded to think critically about our categories and the imposition of them onto others, especially those who lived millennia ago. Does the expectation of humans as individual autonomous agents obscure ontological perspectives that view humans as integral and integrating aspects of a communal whole, which is indivisible based on individuals? Nonetheless, distinct notions of bodily autonomy and an absence of private property do not negate the capacity to subjugate people, place them in subservient roles, and treat them more harshly than others. As noted above, an anthropological perspective from bioarchaeology can shift the focus to the lived experience, health outcomes, and life and death consequences of those subjugated roles. To explore these themes, I discuss a case study from the Wari Heartland site of Concho Pata. We have no written records from this time. Thus, my work here assesses the bioarchaeological record for insights into captive taking and investigates the treatment of those captives to evaluate whether they were sacrificed or incorporated into the community in a subjugated role of servitude. And some of the slides that I will show today will have some human skeletal remains. The broader questions that situate this focused assessment about captive taking and subjugation relates to research on how the Wari Empire expanded and maintained influence and control over diverse groups of people. Previous work has shown the importance of engineering innovations to increase agricultural output as part of that imperial expansion. And bioarchaeological and iconographic studies have shown the role of Wari militarism in establishing control in some zones. So this raises the question about, what about the role of captive taking? So we have some iconographic evidence to suggest that Wari state agents or Wari individuals perhaps participated in captive taking, but we do have to query whether this is in fact what is being represented and to what ends. So there are a variety of ways that we can try to detect this when we do not have written records or even comments from Spanish chroniclers. There are a variety of correlates that we can document, and I'll list some of these here and then take you through some examples of this. So one thing that we might look at is atypical deposition of bodies or body parts. Iconography, certainly of militarism and captives, can be informative. There is an archaeological chemical technique that we can do called strontium isotope analysis, and I'll talk about that a little bit later and how we can detect non-local individuals. Distinct cranial modification styles is another way to identify groups of individuals who may have been marked differently through their body. And then finally, we can incorporate ancient mitochondrial DNA analysis into documenting individuals that might be of a different genetic group. So very, very briefly, here's some overview of the sites of Concho Pata. In order to document atypical burials, we have to have a good understanding of what the quote unquote normal burials look like. We've excavated over 310 individuals, so we have a very clear sense of what a normal burial treatment would be like. They're typically under house floors. And that you can see here with this individual in a seated and flexed position, oftentimes with bowls placed on top of the hood and on top of the head, and a variety of grave goods. So we have a clear sense of what the proper burials should look like. Here's a plan view of the site of Concho Pata. And what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that most of the tombs come from domestic structures. So families buried their ancestors under their house floors so they could continually venerate them and interact with them. However, in the southern section of the site, there are these two circular and D-shaped rooms that look very different from everything else. And then within these ritual rooms, some isolated human skulls were uncovered. So, this immediately alerted us to the fact that these are atypical deposition of body parts. I won't go into all the description of everything else that was found there. I will just highlight that 31 isolated human skulls were found in these two ritual rooms. Upon further analysis of these isolated skeletal elements or these isolated skulls, I documented these holes that were drilled on the top of the skull. This is significant because this would have been a hole for a carrying cord, further suggesting that these were in fact trophy heads, not just isolated skulls. These are a little bit different from other trophy heads that we see in the Andes, where the trophy head hole tends to be drilled on the front and center of the frontal bone. Here in the Wari Empire, it appears they had a different aesthetic idea of how trophy heads should be displayed, and they were formatted or designed in such a way that the hole was at the top of the head so they could be displayed upright and looking forward. I did a more detailed analysis of these 31 trophy heads, and what I'll note is that there were some, what you're looking at here is the posterior edge of the mandible, right? So of your lower jaw, and these cut marks along that posterior edge indicate that soft tissue was once attached, right? So the cut marks here are evidence that the masseter muscle was intentionally cut. This muscle needs to be cut if one is to separate the mandible from the rest of the cranium. This is significant because it suggests that these were fresh bodies. These are not antique individuals or bodies that had been in tombs for an extended period of time where soft tissue would have naturally degraded. In addition to the cut marks, chop marks were also observed on the inferior portion of the mandible. This tends to appear in cases of decapitation from a cut from behind, and sometimes the mandible receives these chop marks in the process. So this was further evidence of this intense tactile interaction with these bodies and intense manipulation of these body parts. Together, what that particular evidence revealed is that recently deceased individuals were modified, and not that these were naturally decomposed bodies that could have been antiques that were transformed into trophy heads. Other analysis, I won't go into all of the descriptions here, but I will note that with that hole that was drilled on the top of the head, 90% of them have that particular feature, again, highlighting this aesthetic choice or this engineering design in terms of how the Wari state and these master artisans or these ritual specialists who are involved in preparing and transforming humans into trophy heads, they have a very clear idea of how these trophy heads are to be processed. In addition to this kind of standardized way of treating them and processing the actual human remains, there's a lot of iconography, and I won't show it all, but that parallels what we're seeing in the actual skeletal remains. So here, this is a representation of a warrior wearing a trophy head. It was found on one of the ceramic urns in the ritual structures from which the trophy heads came. And as you can see here, right, with a hole on the top of the skull, that would have been ideal for the carrying cord for this warrior to wear around their neck. With the head again upright and looking forward. Now, of course, it is unclear just based on iconography alone or just based on these isolated trophy heads, if this warrior is wearing the head of an ancestor or wearing the head of an enemy. That remains an open question. Nonetheless, with this kind of analysis of the 31 trophy heads, the associated ceramics, one kind of result or one idea that comes through is that the trophy head processing and the artistic depictions of them are quite standardized. And I think that suggests Wari state oversight. It's not that we have a variety of kin groups or different social groups that are producing trophy heads in a variable manner, conducive to kind of their own idea of how a trophy head should look. There's a very clear idea of how they should be prepared and how they should be depicted. So to that question of the trophy heads, because we have issues where heads and body parts are interacted. Humans interact with these body parts a lot in the pre-Hispanic Andes. And so I did not want to make the assumption that these were war victims or state enemies. It could be that if these are the heads of local individuals, it might be that they were ancestors or perhaps they were criminals. Now we know nothing of the judicial Wari system, but from later Inca times, we do know that there were laws and people could undergo corporal punishment. But we really don't have any idea of how the Wari treated criminals. So this remained an open question of trying to establish if they were local or non-local. To address this question, I teamed up with Kelly Knudsen, an archaeological chemist at Arizona State University, and we did strontium isotope analysis of what we thought would be the local burials and then these trophy heads. Now, just very, very briefly, I won't go into all the chemistry, but strontium is something that naturally occurs in bedrock and soil. Right, the plants uptake the strontium from the soil, and then we humans come along and we eat the plants and we eat the animals that eat the plants. And so then we incorporate these strontium isotope ratios into our bones and teeth. The basic idea here is to then establish the strontium isotope ratio in different regions, in this case here of the Peruvian Andes. And you can see this was the local ratio established based on some local animals and some other local burials. The goal here, or the understanding here, is that local people should match the local strontium isotope values, right? And individuals that deviate from the local standard, you might be detecting non-local persons. So, when these analyses were done, we started out with local animals and local burials, and you can see here the strontium isotope ratio of these individuals where everything indicated they should be local in terms of their treatment and the burial goods and so forth. When we processed the trophy heads, you can see that we had a much greater variability in strontium isotope ratios. And so this was a really important piece of information to help us document that the majority of the trophy heads that were recovered from the site of Conchapata were of non-local persons. Together, kind of the iconography, the skeletal analysis, the strontium isotope data suggests that here we might have a case where Warri state agents were expanding into different zones, taking captives specifically for human sacrifice, and then eventually transformation into trophy heads. That currently there's no evidence to suggest that these mostly adult males, some children, there's no evidence to suggest that they were placed in lifelong servitude at this Warri Heartland site. Now, what about other captives? Could captives have been taken for other means or sacrificed in a different way? The strontium isotope data did detect one other individual that came from what we thought was a normal burial. So in looking at this individual a little bit more, it turned out that she was an adolescent female based on strontium isotope suggests non-local origin. But notably, she was buried completely alone, which is highly unusual. Usually you're buried with your kin group under the house floor. And she was buried right in front of this ritual room here that had 10 of the human trophy heads. So her location was quite distinct and unique relative to others. There were no grave goods with her other than 4 tupus, which are metal pins that were likely used to pin her clothing or a shroud together. Notably, we analyzed a canine from her. The enamel crown of a canine completes around the age of 3 to 5 years. So that non-local strontium suggests that she could have been either a voluntary migrant, we have to still consider that, or a captive who was taken some time after she was 5 years old. Additional analyses that I've conducted on the incisor and third molar, where I looked at carbon and oxygen isotope ratio, show that indeed her water sources change, and this corroborates the strontium isotope data. And then notably, as she ages, as you go through time and I analyze the different teeth from different developmental phases, I see an increase in maize consumption, which could have been consumed in the form of chicha, which is a maize beer. So we see an increasing consumption of this highly valued and ritualized beverage known as chicha, and it increases as she approaches adolescence. Now, I do not know the mechanism of death based on the skeletal analysis. There was nothing to suggest that she had what the mechanism of death was. Nonetheless, the location, the treatment, and then the non-local status suggests that she may well have been an offering burial or perhaps a sacrifice to this ritual temple that housed all of those trophy heads and camelid sacrifices as well. It may be that her age, her sex, and her perceived natal identity may have actually structured how she was to be treated in sacrifice, right? In other words, she was not to be transformed into a trophy head like the adult males and the children that were within that ritual room. Now, in terms of detecting other captives and how they may have been treated in Warri society, there was one other atypical burial. This is an elderly female. Again, she was not buried in a kin group. You can see the location of where her human skeletal remains were found. And she too was buried alone, no formal tomb and only one grave good was associated with her. Skeletal analysis shows that she's indeed a female, and an older female died in kind of mid to late 50s, which might suggest that she could have been a long-term resident at the site of Conchapata. Another important detail that marks her as different, right, or an outsider, is she had cranial modification of what's called the annular style. This would have been something that was imposed on her in her infancy by her parents or other elderly or kin members of her group. She was the only person at the site that had this form of cranial modification. Everybody else is either unmodified or they have a form known as tabular erect. So not only, is she treated differently in death, buried alone without any grave goods, during her lifetime, she would have been highly marked, right? It was very obvious that she was not local to this Conchapata community. In addition, ancient DNA analysis with Brian Kemp showed that she had a really unique haplogroup. She belonged along her maternal line. She belonged to haplogroup D, and she's the only one that had that particular that haplogroup affiliation. So given all of these factors, I'm suggesting that she was possibly a female captive brought back to Conchapata. Into what role is unclear, so I suggest that maybe she was a servant, a secondary wife, a spouse. It's difficult to know what to label her, but I can tell you about her life experiences and that she was definitely maltreated during her lifetime at Conchapata. And I say this based on the fact that she had antemortem tooth loss. So you can see here the missing teeth. This is likely from violence, essentially from having your front teeth knocked out. Highly unusual to lose your anterior teeth first. Typically you lose posterior teeth first. So the loss of front teeth is probably from a blow to the face. She also had a healed wound on the posterior of her cranium. This is what we call in the forensic sciences a defensive wound. There's been many studies that have documented in communities or in societies with captive taking, you oftentimes end up with individuals with wounds on the posterior of the skull. In addition,
Tiffany, you have just a few more seconds.
Okay,
Sorry to
and so she had another wound on the superior of her skull, which was partially healed, fractured ribs. So a lot of repeated violence, injuries to her hand, and then an unknown mark on her forehead. I don't know what caused this. It doesn't seem to be pathological, but some kind of a mark, right? And some compression fractures on her vertebra. So altogether, what this research is showing is that you've got the Wari state expanding out into distinct areas, taking captives, sometimes for sacrifice of a very specific manner where they get transformed to a trophy head. Other times they're kept intact and whole, perhaps as an offering to these ritual temples. And other times perhaps a captive who may have been taken in, placed on a lower social rung within the community and placed into servitude and maltreated within Wari society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, for sharing with us this incredible research. And our next speaker is Elizabeth Urban, who is Associate Professor of History at Westchester University of Pennsylvania, where she specializes in the first 2 centuries of Islamic history. She particularly seeks to understand how Islam transformed from a small and relatively egalitarian Arabian piety movement into the official doctrine of a hierarchical Near Eastern empire. Her first book, Conquered Populations in Early Islam, which just came out with Edinburgh University Press in 2020, analyzes how Muslims of slave origins joined the Islamic community and articulated their identities within it. The book posits that enslaved and freed persons provide a fruitful window onto early Islamic history because, as liminal figures, they sparked debates about the political, social, and religious boundaries of the expanding Islamic community. Her current research continues to explore how relationships of freedom and dependency operated in the earliest Islamic polity. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me share my screen. All right, yes, thank you. I'll just echo the thank yous that people have been giving to LAMIA and the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies for putting on this workshop today, and for Craig for being our discussant. So my paper today analyzes courtesans and scribes, 2 types of enslaved persons from early Islamic history, talking around 700 to 900 CE, who illuminate the interconnected history of slavery and high culture. So let me give you just a little bit of a background on each of these 2 groups before I turn to the issue of slavery's archive. And again, the period I'm talking about here is approximately 650, 700 to about 850 or 900. So qiyan, or courtesans, sometimes translated as singing girl in older sources, were enslaved women who were trained as entertainers and musicians. They received extensive training in Arabic poetry, song, stringed instruments such as the oud and the tambour, as well as the art of fine manners and witty conversation. And the image here is a reconstruction of Samarra mural by Herzfeld. It seems that these courtesans often received their musical training in the Arabian centers of Medina, sometimes Mecca, but mostly Medina. And then they were often sold to other urban centers such as Damascus or Baghdad. They performed at soirees attended by other poets and musicians and cultural and political elites. The most famous of them could end up in the service of the caliph himself. And they were usually enslaved, at least at the beginning of their lives. They earned wealth for their masters and could be sold to new masters for enormous prices. But manumission was also common in my historical context, and it seems that some of these women at least could become freed during their lifetimes. The most famous of these women courtesans lived in the 9th and 10th centuries in Abbasid Baghdad, but my research focuses on an earlier period. The earliest notable female singers come from the late 7th and early 8th century, again, mostly in Medina. These include people like Azza al-Mailat, Jamila, Salama, Hababa. These are some people that I'll talk about a little bit more later. As both the kutab or scribes or secretaries, these are administrators who work for the expanding Islamic empire. They're keeping track of the taxes. They're sending official letters on behalf of the caliph and governors. They basically helped keep the imperial apparatus running. And they could come from a variety of backgrounds. And this is an area where you see historical change over time. The first scribes or secretaries were actually free Arabian tribal notables, often relatives of the caliphs and governors. Then there's a period where they transitioned to using more subaltern people. And by the time that I study, most of the bureaucrats seem to have been freed persons known as mawali, which I'll talk about more that term in a moment. So some notable examples from my period: Salim Abu al-Ala, Abd al-Hamid al-Katib, Abdullah ibn al-Muqaffa. These are famous founders of Arabic prose. And that's how they've been remembered, not necessarily as kind of functionaries, but as founders of Arabic prose style. So the reason I view both of them together is that they were both enslaved or formerly enslaved persons who could nevertheless gain a great deal of wealth, political power, cultural prestige. There's sometimes in my field, this term elite slavery is used to describe these people who were enslaved but could attain power and prestige. They participated in high culture, the creation of Arabic poetry and prose. But as enslaved or formerly enslaved people, they had to use their linguistic mastery of Arabic poetry and prose carefully. They were under constant scrutiny by their patrons and masters. Especially the courtesans could be beaten and sold away by their masters. They were blamed for being corrupters of society. The scribes were sometimes scapegoated or blamed for problems in the government. So language mastery was both a form of opportunity and advancement for them, but also a survival skill that they used to mediate their unfree position. Okay, so these are the two groups that I study. Now I want to turn more to the issue of slavery's archive. I'm thankful to this workshop for pushing me to think more about the issue of archive, which is not one that I had really thought about much before when thinking about enslaved persons' legacy in the literary material. So we actually know quite a bit about the courtesans, the most famous of which being kind of famous divas in my field, such as Arib and Fadl Inan. Their stories and their songs are recorded by male authors of the Abbasid period, such as this is depicted here, Abul Faraj al-Isfahani's Book of Songs, which tells stories about their lives and their music. And so, and the same author wrote a book called Slave Poetesses, so that focuses entirely on slave women who composed their own poetry. So in that sense, we really do have something like an oral archive of these women's poems and songs, though of course this archive has been collected and filtered by male authors. Several authors of Arabic literature and musicologists have studied these poems. As for scribes, again, we have something of an archive of some of the most famous of these scribes, such as Abd al-Hamid al-Katib and Ibn al-Muqaffa, because we have many of their letters and writings recorded by later literary sources who thought of these men as founders of Arabic prose. But we also have actual material archives about some of the early Islamic scribes. Most of these archival materials come from early Islamic Egypt, papyri from Egypt. Yusuf Raghib has written an article tracing the changing use of slaves as scribes in the early Islamic bureaucracy in Egypt. And as you can see here, there's a project now at Leiden University run by Petra Seipenstein and also scholars there such as Jelle Brunning, who work with papyri to understand Islamic conquests from below, from the perspective of these documents. However, I am not a scholar of manuscripts or of Arabic literature. I am a social historian and a cultural historian who uses these literary sources to try to understand the history of enslavement and slavery. So I wanted to think about how I might use some of my sources that I use, which are not documentary sources, but literary sources, to understand kind of an archive of slavery from my period. So reading some of the sources that I've mentioned here, the first issue that came up for me was trying to parse when my sources are reproducing or claiming to reproduce writings from enslaved persons versus when they're reporting formal composed poetry by these persons versus when enslaved persons are quoting or reciting other people's poetry versus when these sources simply report kind of informal speech or informal action. And it's kind of parsing the difference between orality and written sources at least as reproduced in our literary sources might give us some more insight into the roles of writing and orality in these cultures and in this particular context. So I think it might be really worth systematically going through the sources and charting the kind of categories as I've laid out here, which is a much bigger project than what I can do right here. But the second issue, so that's kind of one of the methodological issues that came up. The second issue that came up, and this echoes what some of the other presenters spoke about earlier today, is that it can be very difficult to tell when we're looking at actual slaves versus formally enslaved persons. The sources use euphemisms such as boy and girl that are ambiguous. Manumission was very common in my historical context. And the term maula, which is used to describe freed slaves, is also itself extremely ambiguous. I wrote an entire dissertation on it. It can mean former slave, freed slave. It can mean former master. It can mean client. It can mean patron, convert, ally, relative. It can mean almost anything. So I'll point out in just a moment when we see a woman described as maula, trying to parse out what that means. So bearing these problems and questions in mind, I think just scratched the very surface for today's workshop to try to tease out a little more about what these sources tell us about slavery's archive. So I'm actually going to start with just a note on scribes because I found so little there. And I'm going to just briefly summarize that before I tell you more about what I found for courtesans. So in my source that I used here, which for today was this one in the middle here, Al-Jashiyari's Book of Viziers and Scribes, I wanted to see if there was a reproduction of enslaved persons' writings. And I did not find anything like an actual reproduction of a letter or bureaucratic document from a slave in this source. There are writings from a free Arab Muslim, from a Christian, from an assimilated third generation Maula, the freed slave. But I didn't find anyone by a slave, someone who was unequivocally a slave. The closest I could find was when a governor chastises a young man or boy for writing the wrong word in one of the tax registers. So an unnamed slave only makes it into the account when he makes a mistake. So this evidence is inconclusive, especially since Yusuf Raghib has shown that some slaves did indeed act as scribes in the bureaucracy. And this is only one source, but I think it would be worth searching further for slaves' writings. But I think it's telling that in this source, a slave only makes it into the author's purview when he makes a mistake, kind of blaming, kind of a classic paradox of slavery, that while masters absolutely rely on their slaves' labor, they also criticize that slaves' labor, or kind of only comes to their attention when they have something to complain about. But for the courtesans, I found a little bit more that I wanted to go into. with regard particularly to what these women have to say about their own experiences as enslaved or unfree persons, and particularly the relationships they describe having with others. So just to give us a quick example, we have Jamila, who is a Maula, married to a Maula, meaning she is ostensibly a freed slave married to another freed slave. But it's also extremely unclear to me what exactly Maula means in this context. There is no mention of her ethnic origin, her geographic origin, her being bought or sold, her being freed, just simply that she was the Maula of a particular tribe. So she actually seems to have been more like a kind of a second-class citizen or resident alien member of a tribe, rather than anyone particular's kind of client or freed slave. To further complicate matters, she comes to kind of public attention when her maulayat, meaning her female tribal patrons, most likely, hear her singing kind of quietly to herself in private, and they publicize her. They say, you must come out and sing for people. She then gains fame, and she teaches several people. She gains a teaching circle where she teaches people how to play the oud and to sing. But she's most notable for kind of constantly being surrounded by a retinue of female slaves who kind of clamor around her and make a bit of a scene wherever she goes. So she has a diverse teaching circle, but this is what it kind of comes to the attention of the author, is these clamoring female slaves. There's also hints in the account that she's still earning money for her tribal patrons, in this case, her mawali, her patrons, her potentially her former masters. She earns astronomical sums for them, but implies that she's not totally in control of her own earnings, that she is giving some of her earnings in some way to her tribal patrons. And then there's a situation later in her life where her mawali, again, her patrons, pressure her to sing in a situation where she doesn't necessarily want to sing. So this kind of descriptions of her situation makes me really question, even though she's ostensibly free, her social circle still seems largely to be with slaves. Her former masters or patrons still have a great deal of power over her earnings and her body. It makes me simply wonder, where does Jamila fall on the freedom or unfreedom spectrum as a courtesan? Then the other example I wanted to give, I'll explain who these people are, and then I'll walk you through these writings, which are from al-Baladhri's Ansab al-Ashraf, the genealogies of the notables. Hababa and Salama are two of the Umayyad Caliph Yazid II's favorite concubine courtesans. We're talking in the 720s here. These two women are often treated together, often one literally on either side of the Caliph Yazid. But there are clear differences between them. For example, Hababa seems to have exerted more political power. Salama is remembered as having a better singing voice, and she's famous for a relationship she had with an ascetic called Al-Qas, to the point where her nickname is sometimes Salamat Al-Qas. Al-Qas is Salama. But the story I really want to interrogate here is one from Baladhri's Ansab al-Ashraf, where these two women are together with the Caliph as usual, and the Caliph Yazid asks them to have a singing contest, and competition and contestation was a hallmark of this courtesan culture. And in this case, even though Salama is remembered as being a better singer usually, Hababa wins the singing contest. She gets more at what is in the Caliph's heart, she pleases him more. And so he says, tell me what you want as a reward for having won the singing contest. And she says, I want Salama and her money. That is, essentially, I want you to sell me Salama. I want you to give her to me. And he says, ask for something else. And she says, no. So he relents and says, take her and her money. And she did so. After this, according to Baladhri, Salama fell into a bad way. It's not totally clear what happened, that she got depressed or something like that. The Arabic is a little unclear. And so Yazid asks her, meaning the Arabic sources are famously, they use kind of unprecedented pronouns, asked Hababa to sell Salama on his behalf. That is, she doesn't like being owned by you. She's not happy. Please sell her. And Hababa says, okay, she's free. And now I will marry her to you, because now I'm her maula. That is, I am her patron. I have set her free. I'm her former slave owner. And now I have the prerogative as her former master to marry her to you. And he laughed. So this account is it's been in my mind for a long time now to try to parse out, is this actually a transfer of ownership? I'm not really sure that this is really trying to show a transfer of ownership. I think this is meant to be a joke, teasing, flirtatious kind of banter, but just the way that Hababa here is playing with her own and Salama's own enslaved status as part of the joke really struck me, that she's playing with the rights of the owner versus the right of the slaves, the rights of the patron over the freed slave versus the patron versus the freed slave, the positions of the enslaved concubine and courtesan versus the free wife. So this source is very convoluted and it needs more unpacking, but at least we can see here the beginnings of the way these women played with and thought about their own enslavement that gets actually wrapped up into their culture as courtesans, that involves a culture of competition and of kind of witty banter and flirtatiousness. So analyzing these two accounts is really just the first step of a much bigger project that I'm thinking about, and I'm still just in the planning stages, but trying to think of how can we gain a broader picture of kind of patterns going on here. One idea is to create a database where, as we mentioned, we kind of parse out these depictions of enslaved persons' cultural production and kind of parse it out. What is writing? What is oral composition? What is a kind of original oral composition and original writings versus quoting or transmission of previous writings, informal speech and actions, including noticing bodily movements, gestures, and facial expressions. And a network number two, a database number two would be networks of relationships, trying to literally map out relationships of parentage, marriage, slavery, clientage, and actually using digital methods and data visualization to help us get a sense of the social life of these enslaved people and the way that these enslaved people were integrated into these networks in their own societies. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for a very interesting talk. And now I would like to welcome Reggie Jackson, who is Associate Professor of Japanese Literature and Performance at the University of Michigan. In addition to having served as an elected member of the Executive Committee in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, and as faculty ally for diversity, equity, and inclusion, Reggie has also been director of the Accelerated Master's Degree Program in Transcultural Studies and director of graduate studies for the Center for Japanese Studies. Broadly speaking, he's interested in the relationship between aesthetics and politics across a range of media, historical periods, and cultural contexts. More specifically, his research interests include medieval calligraphy and illustrated hand scrolls, Noh dance drama, contemporary Japanese choreography, and the intersections of gender and critical race theory. One goal of his scholarship and teaching is to reimagine a field of Japanese studies in generative ways that prove more open to diverse archives, questions, and contributions. He's the author of the scholarly monographs Textures of Mourning, Calligraphy, Mortality, and the Tale of Genji Scrolls, and A Proximate Remove, Queering Intimacy and Loss in the Tale of Genji, forthcoming this year. Currently, he's revising a book on feminist dance called Yasuko Yokoshi, Choreographic Translation Beyond Japanese Culture. His newest research project examines the relationship between slavery and performance in pre-modern Japan, drawing from Black studies and Japanese studies to read beyond their respective disciplinary blind spots. Thank you so much, Reggie, for joining us.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you everyone for all your presentations today and for showing up. I'll share my screen. So how should we understand the relationship between slavery performance and the archive in medieval Japan? To explore this question, I consider the representation of slavery in no dance drama through readings of the dramaturgical writings of master actor, playwright, and theorist Sayami Motokiyo, whose dates are 1363 to 1443, and the play Jinen Koji, or Genuine Preacher Jinen, which was made famous by Sayami's father, Kanami, who died in 1384, and revised by Sayami himself. The play's plot is simple. A filial girl sells herself into slavery to pay for her parents' funeral rites, and a daring Buddhist preacher dances to purchase her freedom. But in staging both a reading of the enslaved girl's documentation and a turn away from that documentation to spotlight spectacular gestures instead, the play allegorizes an ambivalence toward the archive from which we might learn. Performance studies and queer studies scholars such as Diana Taylor and Jose Esteban Munoz have challenged facile notions of the archive by highlighting the performative maneuvers through which historical archives are destabilized, exceeded, reimagined, or retooled in response to contemporary pressures. Munoz leverages the concept of gesture to undercut constrictive notions of evidence. Explaining that, quote, queerness has an especially vexed relationship to evidence, he writes, the key to queering evidence is by suturing it to the concept of ephemera. Think of ephemera as the trace, the remains, the things that are left hanging in the air like a rumor. This emphasis on ephemera complicates any sense of a stable archive by introducing a corporeal potentiality that precludes textual closure. He then continues, quote, so much can be located in the gesture. Gesture signals a refusal of a certain kind of finitude. If we recognize this finitude as connoting certitude, rectitude, and pretensions toward objectivity, then gesture's refusal of it, however gentle, forgoes these stabs at finality. An epistemology attuned to gesture's capacious surplus, in which, quote, so much can be located, would accommodate more interpretive leeway than rubrics bent on the finitude of hard facts. Perhaps most pertinent for our purposes at this workshop is how Munoz's emphasis on the ephemeral nature of gesture highlights its malleability and its potential to escape archival capture. By examining gesture's vexed relation to the archive through an analysis of no dance dramas and dramaturgy from the 15th century, I would like to suggest that slavery's portrayal in these plays helps us theorize how the ephemerality of gesture might suspend or refuse logics of dehumanization and epistemologies of enclosure germane to both systems of enslavement and their archives. This is coming out of a work on a book project called Spectacular Dominion, Slavery Performance and the Boundaries of Personhood in Premodern Japan. And for the purposes of today, I just want to say that I'm interested, obviously, in the relationship between gesture and evidence, and trying to kind of think a bit about the limitations of our kind of different methodological tools. In this book, one of the things I focus on in the first part are medieval plays or dance dramas about slavery. And this is actually a clip from a 1996 performance of the Kanzei troupe of the play that I'll talk about a bit today, Jinen Koji. On the left, you have the slave master. In the middle, you have Jinen Koji, this charismatic preacher. And then you have in drag this poor child who is acting as the slave girl in the play. The people that I'm most interested in are listed here, just so you have a sense. And one of the things that's interesting to me about this play, besides the fact that it actually stages an encounter with the document that's then discarded, is that I would argue that it's through this play, the staging of slavery, that Sayami is working out, or kind of in some ways refashioning, public perception of outcast performers like himself. So there's a way in which his relationship as a dramaturge and theorist and playwright is in taking up slavery as a tool to for his own social mobility. What I'd like to propose is that Sayami is producing an archive that redefines the marginal status of outcasts like himself by staging slavery and highlighting the performance of gestural restraint as an alternative to excessive labor. So effectively, what he's doing is using slavery rhetorically and performatively through these plays as a way to not just theorize, but to also kind of perform an alternative to the kinds of enclosure that and exploitation of labor that slavery is representing. So one question to ask then is, how should we theorize the fraught relation between gesture and the archive? In this case, what I have in mind here is that One of the things that I view Zeami is doing is trying to think about kind of labor and trying to move away from having to do too much of it. So, which is to say, kind of, if you look at this image here from some a couple hundred years before he's writing, you have an image of a performer, a sword juggler. This is part of the kind of performance lineage that is from which Zeami's own type of drama and performance is derived. It's much more kind of like circus, with magic tricks and dangerous feats of skill like juggling daggers and so forth. And what I'd like to just kind of to give you a sense of the genealogy here is just to, he moves then, his father's style of performance is in this mode called the demon of powerful movement, or the Rikido Fu. Those of you who read Chinese characters will see that it's a powerful, on the left-hand side here, a powerful shape with the heart of a demon. And this is used mainly for demon roles. Zeami, however, revises this style of performance, partially for it being too excessive, too violent, to something more sustainable, namely the demon of intricate movement, or the Sai Do Fu, whose shape is that of a demon, but whose heart is that of a human being. And one of the things you should notice here is things like the feet, this much primer kind of posture, with smaller, more intricate, more sharply defined line work to suggest something of the humanity of this figure. And that takes us to Jinin Koji, the protagonist of our play. So what I'd like to suggest here is that in this play, one of the things that Zeami is trying to figure out is kind of how to represent labor and how to kind of make the case through performance, through these gestures that are more restrained in many ways, for the humanity and the relative higher social standing of performers like himself. Although a kind of a broader kind of discussion of the vicissitudes of slavery is beyond the scope of this presentation, Wayne Ferris writes that at the bottom of the population, and this is in pre-modern Japan, slaves accounted for about 5% of the population, and were owned by temples, officials, the government, and other wealthy individuals. They had no surname and were essentially held in no higher regard than livestock. They can be bought and sold, with a good slave fetching about the same price as an ox. Masters could break up families by sale or inheritance. And the standing rule was that the children always accompanied their mother. And this becomes a kind of trope in these dramas. In the context of Jinin Koji specifically, you have a fundraiser, a slave trader, and a girl who sells herself into slavery as a filial daughter to pay for the funeral rites for her dead parents. And what she does then is ask Jinin Koji, this famous preacher, to pray on their behalf. One of the things that's interesting here, just to say, is that although Jinin Koji himself is not a slave, she encounters him at this annexed area known as Sanjo, which is a tax-free area outside of temples, where lots of these kind of social outcasts congregate. And so one of the things that he's staging in the play, then I would argue, is a kind of affinity, or at least a possibility of affinity, if not solidarity, between these lower-ranking members of society. Michael Mara actually mentions this in terms of the pun that's used, Jinin Koji and Jinin Kojiki, or natural beggars, since they're so low in the hierarchy of temples that effectively they're not unlike actually the normal performers of these dance dramas, even though they might be slightly higher in status because of their literacy. So in a nutshell, one of the things that's going on with Zeami at this time, he's writing starting in 1400 for another 40 years or so for his death in 1443. And this is the basic move. This style of performance known as sarugaku, he rhetorically is changing the value or the valence of this homophone from sarugaku as monkey music on the left to god entertainment. And here's one of the places that he does this, where he says here, if you inquire into the practices and origins of sarugaku with its promotion of long life, some will tell you it arose at the time of the Buddha, and others will say it was passed down from the gods. And one of the things that he's doing here, and focusing on someone who shows no vulgarity in speech and exhibits yugen or fathomless beauty in his attitude, and then railing against promiscuity, gambling, and excessive drinking, is trying to make the case for a kind of better public attitude towards performers like himself. But I'd like to say that the writings of Zeami and then provide a fascinating archive through which to pursue questions of how subjection and exertion intersect, particularly in terms of performance's capacity to influence how personhood might be asserted or revalued. Specifically, I think the figure that haunts the history of no performance is that of the non-human, or the hinin, whose status characterized most performers of the time. And so what we see in this Fushikaden, we're transmitting the flower through effects and attitudes from 1400 until 1418, is that we get a sense of how such presences actually inspirit the archive and the repertoire. He uses this term, sadogaku, to refer to godly entertainment, but that's a way just to deflect kind of criticism of the true origins of his art. This archival erasure of bestial origins in favor of godly ones was a rhetorical strategy fueled by inescapable concerns about how his audience would perceive someone of his base background. In doing this, then, he's calling attention to the deep debt that he has to folks who were absolutely engaged in promiscuity, gambling, and excessive drinking, for instance. We should understand this as a move, as the beginning of a kind of respectability politics, whose traces we can discern in the archive. Specifically in terms of Zeami's aspiration for kind of social mobility, it requires a different set of gestures, both rhetorically and physically. Along these lines, then, it's important to repress demons. And so we see in the text sketches of the two arts and three modes from 1421 that he then denigrates the demon of powerful movement that we saw on the left in favor of this Saidofu, or the demon of intricate movement, on the right. He talks about the fact that this demon of powerful movement, Hina Bekarazu here, because it moves with a style of forcefulness and vigorous movements, it should offer no visual attraction, which is the kiss of death for an actor, as you might imagine. You want to be visually attractive at all times. And so being too ferocious in this case, which is to say, that excessively moving, actually reduces the appeal and thus the amount of money and support that actors could gain. So this is a very kind of material kind of investment here in gesture and restraint. Along these lines, then, he then later goes so far as to say that this older demon form, which is very much a part of his own lineage, is an aberrant style, or ipu, and not recognized by our lineage, which is to say he's trying to effectively use the archive to remove the history of this set of this performance style, so as to seem more couth and of higher status. Which brings us to the play, and I'll give a quick reading here before concluding. One of the things to notice here is that Zeami, in his 1423 treatise, talks about how charismatic figures like this preacher can make the most of expressive display, singing engagingly. Moreover, that the expressive capacity of this kind of figure, which I think of as being synonymous with a kind of gestural capacity, actually is much greater for this figure because it's less kind of overtly ferocious. And what this means then with something like the priest Jinan is that you can draw on this mode of intricate movement to perform. Here's an image of the mask that's used. There's lots more to say about kind of homoeroticism and the gendered aspects of what's going on in terms of the appeal of this character. But suffice it to say, for our purposes in terms of thinking about this play as an allegory, maybe for a relationship to the archive or to documentation, we see here from this 1996 performance, Jinan here at the outside of the temple praying. The girl then comes to him with a robe, which is a kind of currency here, and a letter that she is then going to share with him about her circumstances. She's brought in, Jinan Koji reads this letter, is moved partially because she has sold her body. And there's a pun here on her body and the robe that she's using. He then cries profusely. This is a gesture for crying. Because he's so moved by this record of her enslavement, the kind of receipt, right? And one of the things that, for our purposes, maybe I want to end on is just thinking about the fact that he then, being so moved by this document, decides that he must liberate her. And so he's willing to, as it says here in Japanese, to throw away his body in order to help her. right, to kind of throw away his life. He takes this robe, and at a climax part of the play, he then rejects the transaction by tossing the robe at the slavers in the boat who are about to abscond with the girl. And moreover, to go and stop the boat, which is to say to interrupt this transaction, if not this, this entire system of enslavement itself. He lays claim to it, only to have the slavers then beat the girl and take out that violence on her. So what I'd like to pause and think about here is kind of how this rejection, the document moves him to act, literally to try to work against slavery in a process of abolition, and then identifies with the slave girl before freeing her. In conclusion, then, what I want to kind of have us think about is this, the ways in which these archives bear traces of both this kind of aspiration, like what I'm calling the kind of medieval respectability politics that Zeami is engaging in, but also what it can't actually capture, namely some of these feelings of affinity, of solidarity, of outrage, and so forth that are best left to the stage. I'd like to maybe close then just by saying that in this vein, I'd like to argue that Zeami attempts to cleanse both the textual archive and the embodied repertoire of vulgarity, a goal signified by his focus on ennobling performance modes such as the demon of intricate movement and protagonists like Jin and Koji. His focus on dance over document within that play specifically implies a preference for physical gestures performing righteous outrage, chivalry, or restraint. These gestures constitute refusals of the finitude implied by tainted origins and underscore Zeami's own ambivalence or distrust toward textual archives as being ultimate or sufficient guarantors of legacy. What his play proposes through the figure of the rescued slave, then, is the emergence of new affinities that might liberate the abject social actor instead of anchoring them to their shameful past or dismal present. I think then that when you depart from this documented script, the gesturing body in particular flees a kind of foreclosure bound to enslavement and its evidentiary logic. And I think that in that regard, it deserves more of our attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reggie, for a fascinating talk. And Craig, we have a few minutes for your comments.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to keep my comments to 5 minutes so we have more time for discussion. I know there are also other hands raised. So if I move quickly, panelists, that's no comment on the richness of your presentations, but just trying to move forward. So Professor Tung asks us, what do we do when there are no written records? And what she does by using bioarchaeology is, I think, show us in very vivid and visceral ways the violence and deprivation of slavery, despite the absence of written records. And she's able to do it precisely because she's studying the body and slavery as an embodied experience. Some particular questions I have for you, Tiffany, are about empire and your context. And so you're talking about the Wari people, for example, and you tell us about how they use skulls, for example, as trophies. So one question I have is, what kind of polity are the Wari, and what is their geopolitical role or relationship to other polities in the Andes? And is their particular niche in this context related to the ways in which they acquire and use captives? And might we see other patterns and other kinds of polities in pre-Hispanic Americas? I would also note, and I would, I guess, think about us, all of us, the panelists, how can we embody our study of slavery and enslaved lives? Because even written sources sometimes describe the bodies of slaves. For example, bills of sale in the Arabic ones describe disfigurements, appearances, marks of disease, and other health conditions. And so, you know, in your own sources, do you see an opportunity to think about slavery, its embodiment, and what that tells us about the lived experience of slavery? I would also just note that with bioarchaeology, there are other, which in my mind are related approaches involving sort of genetics and other kinds of research that show us the movement of peoples and admixtures of populations that we can read against our archive for histories of slavery, or even the association between the spread of leprosy and slavery. So Elizabeth, you remind us that slavery is also intertwined with high culture, right? And that enslaved people are not only objects of study, right? But they're also people who wielded technology, produced knowledge, who were themselves agents of empire. I also want to highlight one thing you said is that in discussing the idea of an archive, right, you offer the caveat that while your sources that you are reading are filtered through the words of male authors. And I think I just wanted to also say that all of our sources, written ones in particular, visual, also are filtered in this way. Even documentary sources, which might give the illusion of a kind of perhaps more on towards the objective side of the scale, even though I don't think that should be a goal or is practical, objective sort of reality. But speech and documentary sources are oftentimes recorded according to scripts, right? For example, and people are caricatured according to gender or status. And so I think that what you see there is perhaps a more universal challenge that we all face. In your presentation and also on all these presentations, we saw that slavery has a visual archive. LAMIA, also this is an expertise of yours. And so I'm curious how the visual archive is used in your assemblage of evidence overall, and what is the interplay between visuals and the other kinds of evidence you use. Elizabeth, in your paper, you talk about it even more about digital work and the potential for collaboration. And so I'd like to know, what's your wish list? What kind of infrastructure would you like to see for collaboration, whether it's digital or other kinds of scholarly infrastructure? So Dr. Jackson, your presentation challenges what you call, I'm quoting another scholar, the facile notions of the archive. And I'm really taken by the tools that you give us to think with, particularly the ideas of ephemera and the idea of gesture, bodily gesture. And I do really appreciate how you challenge, right, what I see as maybe, or question the normal rules of scholarship in our field that might marginalize certain subjects and groups and certain forms of knowledge. And so I'd like to hear our panelists talk more about that. Like, do the rules of our field harm as well as help what we're able to know about some people? Do scholarly conventions continue the dehumanization of certain groups of people? A final sort of comment that I would like to raise is the tropes that are in Jin and Koji about slavery, slave traders, slave people seem to me to be remarkably similar to what I see in other parts of the world. And so I was interested to hear the panelists' opinions. Do you feel like you have affinity with the kinds of evidence your co-presenters are sharing? And does this suggest a possibility for something that we might call a global history of slavery? Or, is that adopting a term that perhaps doesn't have yet the substance that we would want it to have? Or do you see interconnections that would suggest such a history?
Thank you so much, Greg, for these thought-provoking questions. Perhaps we could take a first round of answers from our presenters while audience members post their questions on the chat box or raise their hands. Thank you. Who wants to go first? Tiffany?
Sure, I can respond first. I'll try to keep it brief too, so we can have discussion. Thank you, Craig, for your comments on this. I'll just briefly say that to describe the kind of polity that Wari was, the archaeological evidence indicates that it was what we call a state-level society, and by that I mean centralized administration, and is that various means by which they moved out of this imperial core to incorporate other groups. So sometimes it would be through introducing new technologies like agricultural terracing and water canals, right, to enhance agricultural production and extract tribute in that way. And then in other times, it was a more of a militaristic type of strategy to incorporate. There was another state known as the Tiwanaku down in the southern part of Peru, kind of part of Bolivia around the Lake Titicaca Basin. So the Wari and Tiwanaku were the two powerful kind of state level societies in the Andes at that particular time. And then just a variety of other kind of polities that would have spoke, different languages, different forms of cranial modification, different styles of dress, they would have revered different kind of apus or mountain gods and lake gods and things like that. And so there was a very kind of creative integration that Wari did to weave together military authority with ritual authority and kind of agricultural production and camelid herding. And because, as we understand it, there was no notion of private property, our understanding at this point, or I would suggest that the notion of taking people and as captives wasn't so much to control bodily autonomy for, like, let's say, production. Many times it was much more related to taking human captives for sacrifice. So it was just completely oriented in a very different way. And I'll just note that saying, I absolutely recognize we could be missing a huge chunk of the record, and we're just not picking up on a lot of other individuals that were taken captive and placed into something that we might call servitude. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Tiffany. Elizabeth?
I'm actually going to answer your question. I'm going to try to answer your questions briefly about, first of all, what's my wish list for kind of a data thing, a computer thing? You can tell part of my wish list is learning more about computers because I'm really terrified of them and I can see the big picture, but I don't know the steps. So what I think would be needed though, what I can envision is, they can do all this cool data visualization stuff now where you can play with a map, or I don't know if you've seen the map. I saw it on Slate a couple of weeks ago of really showing the slave trade of different ships coming over from different parts of Africa over to different parts of America. And you could see over the passage of time where the ships are going. And so having some idea of the software that it would take, what I'm imagining is literally kind of mapping out those networks. You see those network analysis things that are like little constellations. And so I think first step is just finding a computer person who knows how to translate what I'm talking about into actual computers. But then I think a collaborative kind of data entry point where we kind of, once we figure out the software, can have a team working to literally just comb through the sources. Maybe there's a way to do this, now more and more Arabic sources are digitized and scanned and searchable and readable to actually kind of build out a database. And then I think a big problem with digital history is that it's not published in the one journal that everyone knows to go and read, right? So you have to publish it in a way that is accessible to people, that's upkept. So anyway, I really think that there would be a way to see the social networks that we're kind of trying to talk about here. I think I might have frozen for just a second. And then just to quickly answer your other question, Craig, of kind of what do I see as some of the connections with some of the other papers. I was taking a ton of notes, but especially for this last paper from Reggie, I really was struck by this idea of perhaps a response to the dehumanization of slaves is this to actually kind of skip over the human and go straight to the God. Does that make sense? Kind of saying, well, actually slaves, we're not doing monkey, forgive me for getting it a little bit wrong. We're not doing monkey dance, we're doing the God dance. And you see this in the kind of Islamic sources too, I think, of slaves as spiritual paragons, as kind of Sufi mystics, as it being a kind of a religious duty to manumit slaves. And so somehow maybe seeing that as pushing back against the dehumanization of slaves and the equating of slaves with animals and chattel, actually kind of push back against that by actually focusing on the godliness or connection to God that slaves can bring. So that's just my 2 very quick cents there.
Thank you. Reggie?
Yeah. Thank you so much for the comments, Craig. And to your last question, just briefly, I was going to say that, so I found everyone's presentations really fascinating, and I'm Tiffany in particular, just, you had me at the skull shaping. So one of the part of me who's kind of into all of those, not skull shaping, but kind of thinking about the kind of opposite end of the spectrum, which say where is the jaw, where's the mandible hit by, a certain kind of scraping tool or something like that. I think that's really fascinating to me. At the same so I'm really kind of drawn to that kind of level of detail and kind of scientific evidence on the one hand. At the same time that I'm really exhausted by a version of pretty aggressive and pretty chauvinist kind of positivism within the field of pre-modern Japanese dramatic studies that has no patience at all for any kind of consideration of gesture unless there is actually a kind of a bevy of archival sources to kind of back up the argument. So that's part of what I'm responding to is trying to think about what resources are there in, say, queer studies or in performance studies, that which is not theater history, say, and which is not as kind of, I'd say, frankly, hemmed in by a certain notion of evidence that has everything to do, frankly, with the fact that the archives in Japan are deeply indebted to kind of having really positive relationships with the actor families. So the idea of kind of criticism, or even implied, it actually imperils your access to archives. And so the idea of saying, kind of queer theory, for folks who don't know, it's like, who are you calling gay exactly? Or who are you calling homosexual? And there's a way in which there's this kind of that kind of danger, I think, really closes down these kind of interpretive possibilities. And so to your question about affinities, I think there's absolutely lots of room for lots of different types of methods, and that I'm really deeply interested in personally. But I also feel like part of the goal of a project like the one I'm trying to do now is in some ways of kind of acknowledging that, but also kind of not capitulating to that kind of the gravitational force of that, because it's also a way of frankly, just denigrating and degrading these other kind of foreign styles of knowledge that are not based in this really kind of cultural essentialist, nativist, even kind of privileging of traditional Japanese arts. So that's I think the potential pitfall to kind of keep in mind when we're thinking about affinities disciplinarily.
Thank you so much, Reggie. And we have a couple of questions here in the chat for Elizabeth. Elizabeth, do you see the questions? Do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I can quickly say, though, I think actually we have people in the audience who might even know more about the religious identity of the courtesans. I think every once in a while you'll see a courtesan described as Christian or as partaking in a Christian ritual of some kind, but I think often the underlying assumption is that they're Muslim, but that maybe they weren't born Muslim. But I don't have a lot of detail on that. I think some people in the audience might know more. Did emancipatory movements exist? My view is that nothing like what we would consider a real emancipatory movement existed, but that there are exhortations in the Quran and the Hadith to manumit slaves. So I think of it on kind of on the individual basis, people were encouraged to manumit slaves. But does that mean, was that kind of like an abolitionist type movement? I don't think it went to that level. I don't think it was kind of a systemic, sustained movement to kind of try to get rid of slavery so much as to ameliorate the position of individual slaves and manumit individual slaves, if that makes any sense.
Thank you, Elizabeth.